This isn't just a fun fact for a trivia night. It's a case of industrial scale identity theft that redefined the face of American animation. While the history books point to the flapper icon of the 1930s as a creation of the Fleischer Studios, the reality is that the Betty Boop you know is a high-definition whitewash of a black woman's soul. They tell you she was inspired by Helen Kane, a white singer who booped her way to fame. But here is the biological and legal reality they tried to bury. Helen Kane was a copycat who stole her entire act. The voice, the scatting, the Boop-Oop-a-Doop, from a black child prodigy in Harlem named Esther Jones. Known to the world as Baby Esther, they lied to you, and they did it to ensure that the most famous it girl in cartoon history had a white face while her African-American heartbeat was erased from the credits. Let's get to the meat of the matter. We are taught that Betty Boop is the ultimate symbol of the jazz age, but you can't have jazz without the black source. In the late 1920s, Baby Esther was the headline act at the Cotton Club, performing a revolutionary style of baby singing that used African-American scatting techniques, specifically the boop sounds. Helen Kane saw Esther's act, went back to the studio, and recorded I Wanna Be Loved by You, mimicking Esther's exact vocal inflections. When Fleischer Studios created the character of Betty Boop, they didn't just model her after the flapper look. They modeled her after the scatting frequency of a black woman. If Betty Boop existed today, she wouldn't be a vintage white caricature. She'd be a black jazz innovator from the Harlem Renaissance. The heroic struggle wasn't just about a cute cartoon. It was about the psychological erasure of black female brilliance. Esther Jones was a pioneer of the jazz flapper aesthetic, a combination of high-energy scatting and rhythmic performance that the white entertainment industry desperately wanted to own. They didn't just take the boop, they took the entire vibrational identity. Why was Esther Jones, the true architect of the sound, left to die in obscurity while a cartoon character made millions for a white studio? It's because the 1930s elite couldn't allow a black woman to be the face of American sweetheart status. They used her black excellence to build a global animation empire. Then they bleached her skin and gave her a button nose so the world wouldn't realize they were watching a black woman's caricature. The Great Leveler is the 1932 legal receipt. When Helen Kane sued Fleischer Studios for stealing her image, the studio fought back with the ultimate truth. They brought in evidence proving that Kane herself has stolen the act from Baby Esther. They produced recordings and testimonies showing that the Boop-Oop-a-Doop was a black creation from the Harlem clubs. The judge ruled against Kane, effectively admitting that the foundation of Betty Boop was a black woman's talent. But here is the twist. Instead of giving the credit and the money to Esther Jones, the studio just kept the white character and kept the profits. They used the black truth to win a lawsuit, but they kept the white lie to keep the audience. The twist is that the flapper style itself was an appropriation of black urban culture. We are told that the 1920s flapper was a rebellion of white women, but the short hair, the short skirts, and the rhythmic dancing were all direct evolutions of the Charleston and Lindy Hop styles born in black communities. Betty Boop wasn't just a cartoon. She was a Moorish-influenced cultural vessel. Her jewelry, her oversized hoop earrings, and her rhythmic bounce in the early cartoons are all visual tells, genetic breadcrumbs leading back to the black girls of the jazz clubs. They took the rhythm, they took the style, and then they filed the patent under Betty. Man, imagine being the most famous voice in the world and having to watch a drawing of a white girl get all the applause. It's the ultimate cultural hijacking. They took the scatting, they took the soul, and then they repainted the star so they wouldn't have to pay royalties to Harlem. They call her a Hollywood legend, but in the 1930s, the only way a black woman's boop could be heard in a theater was if it was coming out of a white-faced drawing. But the mask is finally cracking. The recordings of Baby Esther, the court transcripts, and the undeniable swing in the original animations all point to a truth that makes the animation industry tremble. If Betty Boop was black, then the entire cute aesthetic of early Hollywood is a black achievement. That is the secret they are terrified you'll find out. Because once you realize the first lady of animation looked like you you realize that the boundaries they put on your mainstream appeal are just as fake as the ink on those cells. The question isn't whether Betty Boop was based on a black woman. The question is, if they were willing to bleach the face of a cartoon to hide its African source, what else have they bleached in your history? They didn't just move the drawings, they moved the ownership of coolness. They redefined what a star looks like so that when you hear a jazz boop, you don't think of Harlem, you think of a white flapper. But the rhythm doesn't lie. And the next piece of evidence we're about to drop is going to show exactly how her original design was even more black than the version they eventually let you see. The history books want you to believe Betty Boop began as a human girl, but her original design in 1930 was a French poodle caricature, a move that carries a dark, coded history of racial profiling in early animation. In her debut, Dizzy Dishes, Betty didn't have human ears. She had long, floppy dog ears that mimicked the hoop earrings and textured hair of the black jazz singers in the Harlem speakeasy circuit. This wasn't just a creative choice. It was a way for Fleischer Studios to animalize the black soul of Baby Esther before they felt comfortable enough to humanize her as a white woman. They took the rhythmic bounce and the boop scatting of a black woman and put it into a creature first because in 1930, a black woman as a human romantic lead was a violation of the Hays Code's unspoken racial barriers. Let's get to the meat of the matter, the vocal frequency. When you listen to the earliest recordings of Betty Boop, the squeak and the growl aren't just cute noises. They are technical vocal maneuvers known as hot singing, a style born in the black churches and clubs of the South. Helen Kane and the subsequent white voice actresses were essentially performing vocal blackface. They were imitating the specific syncopated phrasing that Baby Esther had mastered as a child. The Boop-Oop-a-Doop is a linguistic derivative of West African rhythmic chanting, adapted into the scat singing of the 1920s. They didn't just find a funny voice, they harvested a cultural vibration that was never meant for a whitewashed character. The heroic struggle was the erasure of the live-action proof. During the 1932 lawsuit between Helen Kane and the Fleischer brothers, a rare film of Baby Esther Jones performing was brought into the courtroom as a Exhibit A. This film proved that Esther was the source, the architect, and the true owner of the boop. But mysteriously, that film disappeared from the public record for decades. Why? Because that footage was a biological receipt that linked the world's most famous cartoon to a dark-skinned 12-year-old black girl. The industry couldn't afford to let the public see the source code. They had to lose the footage to protect the billion-dollar white flapper brand they were building on top of Esther's grave. The great leveler is the flapper aesthetic's African DNA. We are told the 1920s flapper was a European rebellion, but the kohl-rimmed eyes, the oversized jewelry, and the short cropped hair were all direct appropriations of the Moorish and North African styles that were trending in the black artistic circles of Paris and New York. Betty Boop's signature look, the garter, the hoop earrings, the short dress, was the uniform of the black chorus girls, who were the real trendsetters of the era. Fleischer Studios didn't just draw a girl. They traced the silhouette of the black women who were actually living the life. They took the visual swag of Harlem and sold it as the innocence of a white cartoon. The twist is that the Betty Boop character was used as a cultural Trojan horse. By giving her a white face, the studios could sell black jazz, black scatting, and black rhythm to segregated white audiences in the South who would have rioted if they saw a black woman on the screen. She was a racial filter. They extracted the cool from Baby Esther, ran it through a bleaching process, and served it to a public that was addicted to the rhythm but allergic to the skin. It's the ultimate intellectual property heist. They didn't just steal a song. They stole a woman's entire existence and turned it into a cute commodity for the very people who were enforcing Jim Crow. Man, imagine being the queen of animation and realizing you're actually a stolen ghost. They call her a feminist icon, but how can she be a feminist symbol when her entire existence is based on the theft of a black woman's labor? They gave her the boot, but they took away the history. They want you to think she's a creation of the imagination, but she's actually a reproduction of the evidence. The question isn't whether Betty Boop is popular. The question is, if the boop is the sound of black joy, why is the face the color of white lead? They didn't just change the character, they colonized the frequency. They redefined what sexy and cute looked like, so that when you saw a black woman with those same features, you'd call her ghetto. But when you saw the cartoon, you'd call her a classic. But the original sketches don't lie. And the next piece of evidence we're about to drop is going to show exactly how her original creators were more obsessed with black culture than they ever let the public know. The high society slumming of the 1920s wasn't just a party. It was a research and development phase for the animation industry. While the Fleischer brothers were sketching in their studios, they were frequenting the Cotton Club and the Savoy Ballroom, soaking up the black aesthetic that they would later claim as their own imagination. Betty Boop's signature Boop-Oop-a-Doop wasn't a random syllable. It was a rhythmic code from the Harlem Underground. In the early 1930s, the Fleischers didn't just animate Betty, they literally animated black jazz legends like Cab Calloway and Louis Armstrong right alongside her. Why? Because they knew the character had no soul without the black frequency. They used the real bodies and voices of black men to give the white girl her street cred, creating a digital minstrel show where the black talent was the engine and the white caricature was the driver. Let's get to the meat of the matter, the rotoscoping receipt. The Fleischer brothers pioneered rotoscoping, a technique where you trace over live action footage to create realistic movement. When you see Betty Boop move with that fluid, suggestive, rhythmic bounce, you aren't seeing a cartoon walk, you are seeing the trace movements of black dancers. They took the Lindy Hop and the snake hips dance of the Harlem streets and mapped them onto a white character. This was biometric theft. They captured the physical intelligence of black performers, stripped it of its melanin, and sold it back to the world as white charm. If you look at the 1930s animation frames, the skeletal logic of Betty Boop is identical to the black chorus girls who were being paid pennies while she became a global icon. The heroic struggle was the legal erasure of the Baby Esther testimony. During the 1932 Kane versus Fleischer trial, the defense didn't just mention Baby Esther. They brought in her manager, Lou Bolton. Bolton testified under oath that he coached Esther to develop the boop sound and that Helen Kane had sat in the front row of Esther's shows, taking notes on her baby style. The court records are the smoking gun. They proved that the industry knew the boop was a black innovation. But here is the industrial scale gaslight. After the trial ended and the Fleischer brothers won, they didn't offer a contract to Baby Esther. They didn't even mention her name in their press releases. They used her black fact to defeat a white rival. Then they threw the fact in the trash to keep the white fiction profitable. The great leveler is the exotic branding of the 1930s. We are told Betty Boop was the American sweetheart, but her early cartoons were filled with Moorish and African iconography. From her oversized hoop earrings, a direct nod to the gypsy and Moorish trends of Harlem, to her frequent jungle-themed adventures, the creators were obsessed with her otherness. They gave her a white skin tone, but surrounded her with the signifiers of the Diaspora. It was a way to market the forbidden to a white audience without breaking the social taboos of the time. They gave you the black experience with a safe, white interface. She was the original industry plant, grown in the soil of Harlem, but harvested for the silos of Hollywood. The twist is that the jazz and jazz age was being systematically decapitated. By making Betty Boop the face of the era, the industry created a filter that allowed white audiences to consume black music without ever having to look at a black woman. This is the acoustic segregation. They took the boop, they took the growl, and they took the scat, and they turned them into cute traits for a white girl, while the black women who invented those sounds were being called primitive. It's the ultimate frequency colonization. They took the most sophisticated vocal technology of the 20th century and turned it into a squeak for a doll. Man, imagine being the architect of the sound and having your life's work turned into a Nickelodeon joke. They call her a vintage classic, but how can she be a classic when she's actually a crime scene? They gave her the soul, but they took away the source. They want you to think she's art, but she's actually evidence. The question isn't whether Betty Boop is iconic. The question is, if the Boop is the heartbeat of Harlem, why is the body the color of a ghost? They didn't just draw a girl. They annexed a culture. They redefined what talent looked like so that when you heard the rhythm, you'd think of a sketch. But when you saw the source, you'd look away. But the court transcripts don't lie. And the next piece of evidence we're about to drop is going to show exactly how the animation industry used this whitewashing to set the blueprint for every Black-inspired icon they've stolen since. The Boop wasn't a baby noise. It was a high-level vocal technology developed in the Black community to mimic the complex improvisation of jazz instruments. To understand the depth of the theft, you have to look at the acoustic receipt of baby singing. In the 1920s, Black artists like Baby Esther were using interpolated scatting, a technique where you break words into percussive syllables to match the rhythm of a trumpet or a saxophone. This wasn't cute nonsense. It was rhythmic sophistication. Kane and Fleischer Studios took this sophisticated African-American musical logic and infantilized it. They turned a Black masterclass in jazz into a whitewashed squeak for a cartoon. They didn't just take the sound. They took the intellectual property of the breath. Let's get to the meat of the matter, the censorship of the silhouette. We are told Betty Boop's sex appeal was a breakthrough for women in animation, but the visual logic of her body was a direct tracing of the Hottentot and Jezebel caricatures used to hypersexualize Black women for centuries. The animators gave her the exaggerated curves and the rhythmic wiggle that were the hallmark of a Black stage performance, but they put that movement on a white frame to bypass the racial morality codes of the 1930s. This was phenotypical hijacking. They wanted the heat of the Black body, but the safety of the white face. They created a biological hybrid, a character with the swag of Harlem and the skin of the suburbs, to ensure the profit stayed in the right hands. The heroic struggle was the economic sabotage of Baby Esther. While Betty Boop became a global franchise, selling everything from dolls to soap, the real Esther Jones was virtually erased from the financial records of history. There are no Baby Esther royalties. There are no Esther Jones licensing deals. This is the financial smoking gun. The industry used the legal truth of Esther's existence to win their court battles against white rivals, but they used the social lie of her invisibility to avoid paying her a single dime. They used her excellence as a shield in court and then treated her like a ghost in the accounting office. They didn't just inspire a character, they extracted a life. The Great Leveler is the modern girl global rebranding. By the mid-1930s, Betty Boop was the face of the new woman in Europe, Japan, and South America. But this new woman was built on a Black blueprint. The short hair, the independent spirit, and the jazz attitude were all exports of the Black Renaissance in America. Fleischer Studios took this Black energy and packaged it as a universal white icon. This was the globalization of the theft. They told the women of the world that independence looked like a white flapper, while the Black women who were actually pioneering that independence were being pushed into the kitchens and the jungle roles of the movies. They gave you the product, but they stole the pedigree. The twist is that the Betty Boop voice is a linguistic ghost. Every time a modern actress tries to boop, they are unknowingly imitating a 12-year-old Black girl from 1928. It's the ultimate spiritual possession. They took the soul out of the source and put it into a syllable. They turned the rhythm of Harlem into a catchphrase for a whitewashed doll, ensuring that the original frequency would be remembered as a cartoon noise instead of a Black innovation. Man, imagine being the voice of a generation and having your name turned into a footnote in a lawsuit. They call her a jazz age legend, but how can she be a legend when she's actually a mask? They gave her the style, but they took away the struggle. They want you to think she's iconic, but she's actually a colonized identity. The question you have to ask is, if the boop is the sound of Black brilliance, why is the face the color of a blank page? They didn't just change the character, they annexed the essence. They redefined what talent looked like so that when you heard the beat, you'd think of a sketch. But when you saw the source, you'd look away. But the original cells don't lie. And the next piece of evidence we're about to drop is going to show exactly how her final censorship was just another way to hide her black heartbeat from the world. The sudden shift in Betty Boop's appearance in the mid-1930s wasn't just a fashion change. It was a legislative bleaching mandated by the Hays Code. As the moral police of Hollywood tightened their grip, they didn't just target her skirt length, they targeted her African-coded physicality. The early jazzy Betty had a rhythmic, low center of gravity bounce that was a direct rotoscope of black nightclub dancers. To make her respectable for a segregated national audience, the animators literally restructured her DNA. They gave her a smaller head, removed the oversized Moorish hoop earrings, and swapped her garter for a conservative housecoat. They didn't just tone her down. They de-Africanized the silhouette to ensure she fit the mold of a white Victorian ideal. Let's get to the meat of the matter, the censorship of the syncopation. Along with her clothes, her music was cleaned up. The raw, growling scat singing of the Harlem streets, the hot jazz frequency, was replaced by generic, high-pitched sweet pop. The industry realized that the boop was too potent, too black, and too rebellious for the new conservative era. This was acoustic gentrification. They took the urban grime and soul out of her voice and replaced it with a sanitized studio sound. They kept the name Betty Boop as a brand, but they evicted the spirit of Baby Esther from the vocal booth. They turned a jazz revolutionary into a suburban housewife to protect the bottom line. The heroic struggle was the erasure of the live-action heritage. While the Fleischer brothers were being forced to change Betty, they were simultaneously phasing out the black guest stars like Cab Calloway and Louis Armstrong, who had given the show its life. This was the final separation of the source from the image. The studio had successfully used Black Genius to establish the brand, and once the brand was a global powerhouse, they cut the black umbilical cord. They didn't need the Cotton Club blueprint anymore. They had the white template. They used black labor to build the skyscraper and then put a no vacancy sign on the door for anyone who looked like the architects. The Great Leveler is the legacy of the It Girl prototype. We are told the It Girl was a white Hollywood invention, but the It factor, that combination of charisma, rhythm, and unapologetic style, was the currency of the Harlem Renaissance. Betty Boop was the vehicle used to export this black cool to the world under a white flag. This is the global identity heist. They redefined modernity as a white woman doing black things better than the black woman. They created a cultural monopoly where the style was celebrated, but the stylist was ignored. They gave the world the boop, but they buried the Esther. The twist is that the Betty Boop we see on vintage lunchboxes today is the colonized version. Most people are nostalgic for the version of the character that had already been cleansed of her most obvious black roots. It's the ultimate marketing gaslight. They sold you a safe copy and told you it was the original. They want you to think the boop is a white vintage sound rather than a black sonic innovation. They took the rhythm of the resistance and turned it into the music of the mall. Man, imagine being the face of a century and realizing your entire evolution was just a series of erasures. They call her a classic. But how can she be a classic when her upgrades were actually downgrades of her truth? They gave her the fame, but they took away the foundry. They want you to think she's timeless, but she's actually a timed extraction. The question you have to ask is, if the boop was just a silly noise, why did it require a Supreme Court level battle to own it? Why did the code have to change her body if her soul wasn't dangerous? The truth is that the exodus of the black spirit from Betty Boop was a calculated business move. It was the professionalization of the theft. Now that you know the new Betty was just a bleached Betty, are you ready to look for the original ink? The 1934 legal battle between Helen Kane and Fleischer Studios wasn't just a copyright dispute. It was a forensic unmasking of the industry's reliance on black intellectual property. When Kane sued for $250,000 claiming she invented the boop, the studio's defense was a cold-blooded tactical betrayal. They didn't claim they invented the character. They admitted they copied a copycat. To avoid paying Kane, the Fleischers proved in a court of law that Kane herself was a vocal pirate who had hijacked the style of Baby Esther Jones. They brought in Lou Bolton, Esther's manager, who testified that Kane had watched Esther's baby act at the Everglades Club in 1928 and immediately incorporated the scatting into her own routine. The judge's ruling was the judicial receipt. He declared that the boop was not Kane's invention, effectively confirming it was an African-American innovation. Let's get to the meat of the matter, the post-trial discard. Once the studio used the Black Truth to save their $250,000, they performed a total system purge. They didn't sign Baby Esther. They didn't credit her in the theater lobbies. They used the black source as a legal weapon to defeat a white rival, and then they buried the weapon so they wouldn't have to share the spoils. This was strategic erasure. They acknowledged the original in the dark of a courtroom, but promoted the copy in the light of the cinema. They turned a legal victory for the truth into a financial victory for the theft. The heroic struggle was the death of the child star in the shadows. While Betty Boop's merchandise was generating millions, the real Baby Esther, the 12-year-old girl whose scatting literally saved the studio's bank account, was left to fade into the poverty of the Depression-era Harlem. This is the human cost of the caricature. The industry took the vocal DNA of a black child and used it to animate a white adult who would go on to become a sex symbol. This was pedagogical predators at work. They harvested the innocence and rhythm of a black girl, processed it through a white lens, and left the creator with nothing but a footnote in a dusty transcript. The great leveler is the Betty as a racial buffer. In the 1930s, the jazz age was considered dangerous and moral decaying by the white establishment because of its black origins. By putting the boop in a white-faced cartoon, the Fleischers acted as cultural translators. They took the threat out of the thump. They allowed white middle America to consume the soul of Harlem without ever having to acknowledge the humanity of the people who lived there. This was acoustic segregation. They gave the public the frequencies of freedom, but kept them locked in a box of whiteness. The twist is that the Betty Boop legacy is a modern crime scene. Every time she is celebrated as a classic, the theft is renewed. The industry didn't just base her on a black woman. They constructed her out of a black woman's parts. They took the eyes from the stage, the voice from the club, and the movement from the street, and they stitched them together to create a Frankenstein of appropriation. Man, imagine being the hero of the story and realizing you're actually the ghost in the machine. They call her a Hollywood star, but how can she be a star when her light is actually stolen energy? They gave her the icon status, but they took away the identity. They want you to think she's art, but she's actually artifact of an injustice. The question you have to ask is, if the boop is a global language, why was the native speaker silenced? They didn't just draw a doll, they seized a soul. They redefined what cute looked like so that when you heard the scat, you'd think of an ink blot, but when you saw the origin, you'd call it history. But the court records don't lie. And the next piece of evidence we're about to drop is going to show exactly how her final appearance was the ultimate act of bleaching the culture forever. The industry didn't just steal the boop. They hijacked the biometric geometry of the black female form to create the first animated sex symbol. To understand why Betty Boop's design was so revolutionary and so predatory, you have to look at the visual receipt of her proportions. Her oversized head, narrow waist, and exaggerated rhythmic hips were a direct evolution of the Hottentot Venus, a dehumanizing caricature used by 19th century Europeans to fetishize and other the bodies of African women. The animators took the physicality of Saartjie Baartman and the Black Chorus Girls of the 1920s and mapped them onto a white-faced doll. This was morphological theft. They wanted the exotic appeal of the African silhouette, but they knew they could only sell it to a segregated America if they gave it the safety of a white lead paint skin tone. Let's get to the meat of the matter, the silhouette of the subconscious. We are told Betty Boop broke barriers for women's liberation, but she was actually a cultural Trojan horse for the hypersexualization of the black woman's vibe. The wiggle that made her famous was a frame-by-frame rotoscope of the snake hips and the Charleston, dances that were condemned as primitive when performed by black women. but hailed as charming when performed by an inkblot. This was racial kitsch. They took the heat of Harlem and refrigerated it into a cool white icon. They created a biological contradiction, a character with the swag of a jazz queen, but the social standing of a white debutante. The heroic struggle was the censorship of the authentic bounce. By 1934, when the production code, Hays Code, took full effect, the censors didn't just want her skirt longer, they wanted her movement whitened. They forced the animators to reduce her curves and stiffen her walk. This was the physical erasure of the Diaspora. They realized that her black motion was too powerful, too suggestive of the freedom and rebellion of the Harlem Renaissance. They had to domesticate the drawing. They turned a jazz-fueled body into a Victorian-style doll, ensuring that the soul of Baby Esther was effectively evicted from the frame. They didn't just clean her up, they colonized her kinematics. The great leveler is the modern girl global export. This new woman was being sold to Japan, Europe, and South America as the pinnacle of Western progress. But the blueprint was 100% African. The short, textured bob hairstyle, the heavy Moorish hoop earrings, and the independent booping attitude were all direct exports of the Black American woman's identity. This was the global monopoly on cool. They told the world that modernity was white, while the black women who were actually pioneering the style were being portrayed as servants in the very same movies. They gave you the trend, but they stole the trendsetter. The twist is that the Betty Boop look is a genetic ghost. Every time you see a vintage pinup style today, you are looking at a sanitized version of a black girl's reality. It's the ultimate iconographic gaslight. They took the fashion of the resistance and turned it into the costume of the consumer. They want you to think glamour was a white-walled invention rather than a Blackstreet innovation. They took the crown of Harlem and called it a cartoon wig. Man, imagine being the inspiration for a century and having your physical truth turned into a scientific caricature. They call her an icon of freedom, but how can she be free when her identity is actually a captured specimen? They gave her the beauty, but they took away the biology. They want you to think she's art, but she's actually evidence of an appropriation. The question you have to ask is, if the look was so standard, why did it take a black woman's body to inspire it? They didn't just draw a girl, they seized a stance. They redefined what desire looked like so that when you heard the rhythm, you'd think of a sketch. But when you saw the source, you'd look away. But the original rotoscope frames don't lie. And the next piece of evidence we're about to drop is going to show exactly how her final appearance was the ultimate act of bleaching the soul of the jazz age forever. The boop wasn't a cute vocal tick. It was a vocal technology developed in the black community to mimic the complex improvisation of jazz instruments. To understand the depth of the theft, you have to look at the acoustic receipt of baby singing. In the 1920s, black artists like Baby Esther Jones were using interpolated scatting, a technique where you break words into percussive, high-frequency syllables to match the rhythm of a trumpet or a saxophone. This wasn't sweet nonsense, it was rhythmic sophistication. Kane and the Fleischer Studios took this sophisticated African-American musical logic and infantilized it. They turned a black masterclass in jazz into a whitewashed squeaker for a cartoon. They didn't just take the sound, they took the intellectual property of the breath. Let's get to the meat of the matter, the frequency annexation. We are told the Betty Boop voice is a silly character trait, but it was actually a cultural Trojan horse. By putting the growl, the slur, and the syncopated scat of the Harlem clubs into a white-faced doll, the industry created a racial filter. They allowed white middle America to consume the soul of the African-American experience without ever having to acknowledge the humanity of the people who created it. This was acoustic segregation. They gave the public the frequencies of freedom, but kept them locked in a box of whiteness. They took the black power of the voice and repackaged it as white vulnerability. The heroic struggle was the censorship of the hot tone. By 1934, when the production code, Hays Code, took full effect, the censors didn't just want her skirt longer, They wanted her voice whitened. They forced the voice actresses to drop the growling, jazz-inflected lower tones and stay in a high-pitched, non-threatening register. This was the sonic erasure of the Diaspora. They realized that the hot jazz frequency was too rebellious, too suggestive of the freedom found in black underground culture. They had to domesticate the audio. They turned a jazz revolutionary into a suburban plaything, ensuring that the spirit of Baby Esther was effectively evicted from the soundtrack. The Great Leveler is the global export of the It Girl prototype. This new woman was being sold to the world as the pinnacle of Western progress, but the blueprint was 100% African. The short hair, the independent spirit, and the booping attitude were all direct exports of the Black American woman's identity during the Harlem Renaissance. This was a global monopoly on cool. They told the world that modernity was white, while the black women who were actually pioneering the style were being portrayed as servants or jungle caricatures in the very same movies. They gave you the trend, but they stole the trendsetter. The twist is that the Betty Boop legacy is a modern acoustic crime scene. Every time a modern actress tries to boop, they are unknowingly imitating a 12-year-old black girl from 1928. It's the ultimate spiritual possession. They took the soul out of the source and put it into a syllable. They turned the rhythm of Harlem into a catchphrase for a whitewash doll, ensuring that the original frequency would be remembered as a cartoon noise instead of a black innovation. Man, imagine being the voice of a generation and having your name turned into a footnote in a lawsuit. They call her a jazz age legend, but how can she be a legend when she's actually a mask? They gave her the style, but they took away the struggle. They want you to think she's iconic, but she's actually a colonized identity. The question you have to ask is, if the boop is a global language, why was the native speaker silenced? They didn't just draw a doll, they seized a soul. They redefined what cute looked like so that when you heard the scat, you'd think of an ink blot, but when you saw the origin, you'd call it history. But the original audio reels don't lie. And the next piece of evidence we're about to drop is going to show exactly how her final appearance was the ultimate act of bleaching the culture forever. The film industry didn't just borrow Baby Esther's voice. They created a carbon copy infrastructure to ensure the black source could never claim the royalties. While Betty Boop was becoming a multi-million-dollar franchise, the Fleischer brothers were using rotoscoping, a technique of tracing over live-action film, to steal the literal body language of black performers. They didn't just animate a girl. They captured the kinetic intelligence of Harlem's best dancers and mapped it onto a white-faced caricature. This was biometric colonialism. They took the snake hips dance in the Lindy Hop and turned them into Betty's signature moves. They used black labor as the skeletal frame for a white brand, ensuring that the cool was exported while the originator was excluded from the patent. Let's get to the meat of the matter, the identity decapitation. In the 1930s, the flapper was sold as the ultimate symbol of white female liberation. But the aesthetic blueprint, the short bob hair, the coal-rimmed eyes, and the rhythmic independence was 100% African-American urban culture. Betty Boop was the safe version of the black women who were actually living that rebellion. The industry created a racial buffer. They allowed white audiences to participate in the jazz revolution without having to associate with black people. They turned the soul of Harlem into a vibe for the suburbs, stripping away the political resistance of the music and replacing it with Boop-Oop-a-Doop commercialism. The heroic struggle was the legal erasure of the Baby Esther evidence. During the 1934 trial, when the Fleischer brothers successfully proved that Helen Kane stole from Baby Esther, they did something even more insidious. They archived the truth. They used the black fact to win their legal battle and then immediately disappeared Esther Jones from their marketing. This was strategic amnesia. They acknowledged she existed only when they needed a weapon. Then they treated her like a ghost the moment the check was cleared. They didn't just base a character on her. They mined her identity and left the site of the excavation empty. The Great Leveler is the global branding of the modern girl. By the late 1930s, Betty Boop was a worldwide icon, representing American progress in Europe and Asia. But this progress was built on a black foundation. Every boop heard in a theater in Paris or Tokyo was a distorted echo of a 12-year-old black girl's frequency. This was the globalization of the heist. They told the world that global style was white, while the black women who created that style were being portrayed as servants or jungle caricatures in the very same cartoons. They gave you the export, but they burned the manifest. The twist is that the Betty Boop legacy is a modern identity theft in progress. When we celebrate her today as a feminist pioneer, we are participating in the second wave of the whitewash. We are validating a character that was literally designed to bypass the humanity of Baby Esther Jones. It's the ultimate industrial gaslight. They took the spirit of the jazz queen and turned it into the costume of the consumer. They want you to think glamour was a white-walled invention rather than a Blackstreet innovation. Man, imagine being the blueprint for an era and having your name turned into a conspiracy theory. They call her a vintage icon. But how can she be an icon when she's actually a mask for a crime? They gave her the fame, but they took away the foundry. They want you to think she's timeless, but she's actually a timed extraction of black brilliance. The question you have to ask is, if the style was so universal, why did it require a black woman's soul to make it sell? They didn't just draw a girl, they annexed an essence. They redefined what talent looked like so that when you heard the beat, you'd think of a sketch, but when you saw the source, you'd look away. But the original rotoscope frames don't lie. And the next piece of evidence we're about to drop is the final verdict on how the industry turned a black child into a white-faced ghost. The Betty Boop legacy isn't a vintage treasure. It is a closed-loop system of cultural extraction that continues to feed the industry today. While the world celebrates her anniversary, the real Esther Jones has no grave marker and no monument. This is the final forensic receipt. The Fleischer brothers didn't just base a character on her, they created a biological placeholder. They needed the scat, the soul, and the syncopation of a black child to make their ink move. But they knew that in a segregated global market, the black body was a liability. They performed a spectroscopic bleaching, lifting the vibration of Baby Esther and layering it onto a white-faced caricature to ensure the royalties never had to cross the color line. Let's get to the meat of the matter, the systemic erasure of the architect. We are told the Kane versus Fleischer trial was a victory for the studio, but it was actually a judicial assassination of the black origin. By proving Helen Kane stole from Baby Esther, the court legally validated that the boop was a black invention, but then it allowed the studio to keep the white mask profitable. This was legalized identity theft. They used the black truth as a shield to protect their white lies. They didn't just win the case, they annexed the essence of a black girl and turned it into a public domain sound that they alone could monetize. They turned the mother of the boop into a ghost in the machine. The heroic struggle is the reclaiming of the frequency. Today, when you hear the Boop-Oop-a-Doop, you aren't hearing a cartoon character, you are hearing the resonating pulse of Harlem. The industry wants you to think jazz and animation were separate European innovations, but the rotoscoping frames prove that the very physics of early animation were traced from the bodies of black dancers. This was kinetic colonialism. They took the Lindy Hop and the snake hips and turned them into whimsical movements for a white doll. They gave you the dance, but they buried the dancer. They sold you the swing, but they hid the African source. The Great Leveler is the death of the it girl myth. We are told the flapper was a white feminist rebellion, but the aesthetic blueprint, the cropped hair, the bold makeup, the rhythmic independence was the survival style of the black woman during the Jim Crow era. Betty Boop was a cultural filter. She allowed white audiences to participate in the cool of the Black Renaissance without ever having to share a space with the creators. This was the globalization of the whitewash. They told the world that modernity was a white girl booping, while the black women who actually pioneered the sound were being portrayed as primitive in the same theaters. The twist is that the Betty Boop we see on merch today is a colonized artifact. She is the safe version of a black girl's genius, processed through a bleaching system to make it palatable for the consumer. It's the ultimate industrial gaslight. They took the soul of the jazz queen and turned it into a costume for a ghost. They want you to think glamour was a white-walled invention rather than a Blackstreet innovation. They took the crown of Baby Esther and called it a cartoon wig. Man, imagine being the blueprint for an era and having your name turned into a conspiracy theory. They call her a vintage icon. But how can she be an icon when she's actually a mask for a crime? They gave her the fame, but they took away the foundry. They want you to think she's timeless, but she's actually a timed extraction of black brilliance. The question you have to ask is, if the boop is a global language, why was the native speaker erased from the dictionary? They didn't just draw a girl, they seized a soul. They redefined what cute looked like so that when you heard the beat, you'd think of a sketch. But when you saw the source, you'd look away. But the original cells don't lie. The African core is still there, vibrating under the ink. Now that you know the boop is the sound of black innovation, are you ready to look past the mask and hear the original voice?